Y'all know what this is in there, so that, looky there, now we got both in there. We're gonna put it, we're gonna turn it upside down, stick it. Whoa!
I love my dad because of how silly he is.
I like my dad because he lets me work with him and he's the best at music.
What I like about my dad is that he runs his own business and he works on consulting.
I love my dad because he works hard for all of our family. Happy Father's Day.
Things I like about my dad is that he's kind and happy Father's Day.
I love my dad because he helps us get money. Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day, Daddy. My name is Kylie and I like singing songs with Daddy and playing the guitar and riding bikes with him.
What I love about my dad, he plays with me, cheers me up, lets me look at the garden with him.
Dad, because he takes me on his boat. Happy Father's Day. I like my dad when he teaches me to be old. I love my father because he takes me fishing. Happy Father's Day. I love Daddy. I love Daddy. Ow. My dad when he plays with me.
Felicity's favorite thing about Daddy is the fact that he takes care of Mommy. You say, I love you, Daddy. Do you love Daddy?
Yeah.
How much do you love Daddy?
Very much.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Good morning, Tennyson family. Our scripture today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. A man had 2 sons. When the younger told his father, "I want my share of your estate now, instead of waiting until you die," his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and took a trip to a distant land, and there wasted all his money on parties and prostitutes. About the time his money was gone, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him to feed his pigs. The boy became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding swine looked good to him, and no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired men have food enough and to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired man.' So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long distance away, his father saw him coming and was filled with loving pity and ran and embraced him and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and you, and am not worthy of being called your son.' But his father said to the slaves, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him, and a jeweled ring for his finger, and shoes, and kill the calf we have in the fattening pen. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and has returned to life. He was lost and is found.' So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard dance music coming from the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. 'Your brother is back,' he was told, 'and your father has killed the calf we were fattening and has prepared a great feast to celebrate his coming home again unharmed.' The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, 'All these years I've worked hard for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after spending money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the finest calf we have on the place.' 'Look, dear son,' his father said to him, 'you and I are very close, and everything I have is yours. But it is right to celebrate, for he is your brother, and he was dead, and he has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God."
Good morning, everyone. Once upon a time, there was a family named the Millers from Chicago, Illinois. George and Jean Miller and their 2 young children were kind of tired of living in Chicago and the rat race and the stress, the traffic jams, and the congested streets. They were tired of no parking and no time and no friends, and they decided to move to a smaller town for better quality of life. And the town they picked was Blairstown. It had 3 stoplights, it was beautiful old stores, and like a lot of Midwestern towns, it had a beautiful central park that George loved to walk through on his way from home to work. George noticed everything about that park, and it was beautiful and manicured, but he started to notice that there was an older woman, always kind of dressed in gray, hanging out in this park. He didn't really pay that much attention to her at first, but then the more he noticed, the more he became curious about who this woman was. And he finally decided he would ask one of the old-timers in town about who she is. Well, he grabbed a guy named Harold, a real old-time guy from the town, and asked Harold if he knew anything about this lady. And Harold said, "Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. You're talking about the lonely lady of Blairstown Park. I know all about her. If you got time, I'll tell you the story. George said, well, I want to know, and I've got the time. So the two sat down, and Harold told the story. He said her name is Grace Simon. Her husband, Tom, and her moved to town and were newcomers, and they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of anything. But soon Tom was bursting with enthusiasm and ambition, and he bought the furniture store down at the end of Main Street. Within 5 years, then he bought the funeral home at the other end of Main Street. And Tom was a successful businessman as anybody in Blairstown. Good family, good wife, 3 kids, 2 businesses, and well respected. But doggone cancer came and got Tom Simon way too young. Grace Simon, his wife, didn't have much time to grieve. She had to learn to run the businesses, and she did. She was good at it, every bit as good as Tom. But the years passed, and Grace turned 65 and turned the 2 family businesses over to their children, Steve and Stephanie. Their 3rd child, Frankie, the youngest one, had died in a car accident out in Colorado. So Steve and Stephanie started to run those 2 family businesses. Grace really helped those kids a lot at first. They were her businesses, but she gradually gave them to them. She really helped them a lot. In fact, they couldn't have run those businesses. They couldn't have had those businesses in the first place if it hadn't been for Grace. But then they didn't want her around anymore. Kind of a family feud, if you know what I mean. And that family feud all started one day when Grace got a letter from Denver, Colorado. She wouldn't tell anybody what was in that letter, and she was all worked up about it. She said to Steve and Stephanie that she had to have some money to get a plane ticket to go to Denver right away. Well, they thought their mom had lost her mind. Something was wrong with her. But she kept persisting. I gotta go to Colorado, gotta go to Colorado. Well, the kids finally broke down and got her a ticket to Denver, and she headed out west. Well, as it turns out, that mysterious letter was from Frank. Frank, the youngest child. Frank wasn't dead at all, but he might as well have been. It turns out that Frank was in prison on several counts of armed robbery. He had been too ashamed to tell his mother about it, so he had one of his buddies write a letter home to his mother saying that he had been killed in a car accident. He had even been sending clippings from Colorado newspaper that would verify the story and help her believe it. Anyhow, for some fool reason, Frank had decided to write and tell his mother the truth in a letter. I don't know why he did it. He should have left things the way they were, but he insisted on writing that letter. It would have been better for Grace and her family to believe he was dead. Nobody wants a jailbird in the family. Lots of people in this town would have liked to wring Frank's neck for the stunt he pulled. Bad enough that he'd run away from home and did all those rotten things. Let him pay for it. But when he wrote his letter saying that he was dead, I mean, that was the last straw. That was absolutely ridiculous. No use making poor Grace Simon suffer because of it, but he did it anyhow. He sent that letter. I didn't like it one bit, to be honest. I remember that day. But Grace went out there. She went out to Denver, Colorado. Now, according to the best reports that we could piece together in a town our size, we could piece together the report. It said that it was quite a scene in prison when Grace Simon and Frank first encountered each other. They led Grace down a long hallway and into a waiting room with a lot of other people. Pretty somber bunch, I bet. Then the guard took Grace into a small room just off the waiting room. He told her to wait there. Her son would be along. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Mind you, she hadn't seen him for 10 years. She wasn't even sure that she'd recognize him. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and she heard her heart pounding faster and louder. And then there he was, standing in the doorway, and their eyes locked and froze. And they just stood there silently. But Grace moved first, as she always does. Grace moved first and wrapped her arms around her son. She held him tightly, and she cried and cried and cried and cried her eyes out. Old Grace did. She kept on saying, "We thought you were dead. We thought you were dead. We thought you were dead." She said it over and over again. Finally, Frank too softened, wilted, and embraced his mother and held her, and he too started to cry, and cried his eyes out just like a little baby. Anyway, she told him right off that when he gets out of prison, he should come home, that there was room enough for him to live with her, that he should come home to the family, to the town, to his old friends from the past, and that he could always be a partner in the family business. Well, when she got back to Blairstown after that first visit to Denver, she was all excited. "Frankie's alive, my boy's alive, all the accident business was all wrong. He's alive, I tell you, he's alive. I heard her say that, I bet 20 times myself. My boy's alive, my boy's alive." Well, she was about the only one in Blairstown who was excited, because the poor people in Blairstown had never had a native son stay in prison for 30 years for armed robbery. People around here weren't too keen on the whole idea. Frank might have been alive after all, but Frank was a crook, a good-for-nothing crook who told his mom he was dead but wasn't. I mean, what are you supposed to say to a lady about something like that? "Gee, I'm glad your son's alive and in prison." What do you say? People in our town said nothing. It was kind of like an embarrassment about old Frank. Now, Steve and Stephanie, they weren't quiet about anything. Steve and Stephanie had had enough. When Grace told them about Frank, and Frank wanted to come home to disgrace them all and their mama, that's when she told them that he could be a part of the family business. That was the last straw. Steve and Stephanie were dumbfounded. A crook in the family business? Imagine, a town this size, a crook in the family business, selling furniture? It would never work. And Steve and Stephanie were right about that. The whole town agreed about that. No siree, wouldn't work in Blairstown. It wouldn't work in the Lutheran church in Blairstown either. I mean, we all agreed on that. Grace, of course, didn't look at it that way. Frank was her son too, she argued. He had a right to be back in the family. Every time Grace visited the furniture store or the funeral home, she'd talk about Frank coming back and being a part of it. Well, the kids, Steve and Stephanie, finally decided to settle it legally. They had a lawyer draw up the papers to rule Frank out of the business altogether. When Grace protested, and she really protested, she made a stink about it. They told her it was none of her business. It was now their business, and they could do what they wanted. And that she was never to come into their stores and pester them again. The two kids actually put a restraining order on their mother so she couldn't come into the stores and pester them about Frank. "I thought that was really unkind," said old Harold. Grace had given them the stores in the first place. She had helped them all those years, and then to tell their mother that she couldn't even come back in the stores that she'd given them. To be honest, deep down inside, I felt that Steve and Stephanie went too far there. I didn't think that was right, and a lot of town people agreed with me. Well, and worse than that, they didn't even invite Grace over to their homes anymore, because all she did was talk about Frank. Every time they invited her over to her house, they'd talk about Frank, and it would upset Steve and Stephanie so much. They don't even invite their mom over to their house anymore, except for Christmas and Easter. Can you believe that? George, now you see why Grace Simon wanders alone in Blairstown Park. The lonely lady of Blairstown Park, that's what they call her. She's out there right now, watching and waiting. She looks down the highway she's waiting for Frank to come home. She's waiting for Frank to come home. And rumor has it, good rumor, that he's out of prison on parole and coming home any day now. She's watching that highway coming into town, watching for her boy to come back home. But also, she's got her eyes on Main Street an awful lot of the time. She looks to one end of Main Street where the funeral home is, and then to the other end of Main Street where the furniture store is. She's waiting and waiting for Steve and Stephanie to change, watching for some sign of recognition, some sign of love, some softening of the heart, some sign of welcome from Steve and Stephanie. George, the newcomer, finally interrupted the old-timer. You'd think that she wouldn't want anything to do with those kids. What do you suppose Grace would do if those kids, Steve and Stephanie, did give out some sign of recognition, some change of heart? Now it was the old-timer's turn to pause. And Harold scratched his head, thought for a minute, and said, you know, I think Grace would do just like she did with Frank. Yeah, if Steve and Stephanie changed their hearts and their inner attitudes towards their brother, Grace would be so happy. And when they come to their senses, she's going to run and throw her arms around them and give them a great big love. You know, that's just the way Grace was in the past. That's just the way Grace is today. That's the way Grace will be tomorrow. Yep, that's true. That's just the way Grace is. All three of the parables in Luke 15 answer the question raised by the Jewish authorities and the Pharisees and the chief priests about whether it was appropriate for Jesus to care about or even mingle with sinners. And the parables say, of course, it matters. God cares about human beings and rejoices when they are rescued from trouble. And so should we. These parables make one point very clear. Lost people matter to God, and they should to us. We're all one step away from being the older brother and denying God's grace to someone who deserves it. Amen.